today we're going to talk about something pretty incredible, a declassified report that shows just how close the world came to nuclear war back in the Cold War. And the scariest part? One side didn't even realize it was happening. And to really set the stage, just listen to this assessment from Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who would eventually lead the Soviet Union. He said, the early 80s were more explosive than any time since World War II. Now, that's not just political talk. That's a reflection of a real, deeply felt crisis. And it wasn't just him. Check out this conclusion from a secret U.S. intelligence review that was only declassified recently. A top-level White House advisory board basically said that in 1983, the U.S. had put the relationship on a hair trigger without even knowing it. Think about that. A hair trigger. So that right there is the million-dollar question. How on earth do you get to a point where one superpower is getting ready for an imminent nuclear war while the other is completely oblivious? It sounds impossible. So let's unpack this whole crazy story. To get to the bottom of this, we first have to put ourselves in Washington's shoes. We need to look at what U.S. intelligence was seeing in the early 1980s, and more importantly, how they were making sense of it all. So, from the American point of view, they were seeing all this really strange, aggressive behavior from the Soviets. And we're not talking about one or two little things. This was a whole pattern. Unprecedented civil defense drills. They even stopped using the military to help with the harvest, which hadn't happened since right before they invaded Czechoslovakia. They were moving their elite Spetsnaz forces forward, putting nuclear subs on high alert. It was a long and pretty worrying list of activities. But here's the kicker. Despite all of this alarming activity, the official conclusion from the entire U.S. intelligence community was, it was all just a show, a big, elaborate propaganda campaign. And this wasn't some minor opinion tucked away in a memo. No, this was the official line. A 1984 Special National Intelligence Estimate, a really big deal, stated it flat out. They believed strongly that the Soviets weren't actually scared. They were just posturing, trying to scare the West and stop NATO from deploying new missiles in Europe. But as this declassified report makes devastatingly clear, that American assessment was dead wrong. Inside the Kremlin, a completely different and, frankly, a much more dangerous story was playing out. And this right here shows you the massive disconnect at the heart of the crisis. While the U.S. saw a propaganda campaign, the Soviets were genuinely terrified of a surprise American attack. What Washington just wrote off as political bluster, Moscow was interpreting as actual preparations for war. The gap between these two realities was getting wider and wider. To really understand just how deep this Soviet fear went, you have to know about a top-secret project they had going inside the KGB. It was a computer program called VRIAN. That's short for Sudden Nuclear Missile Attack. Its whole job was to crunch the numbers on the balance of power and scream a warning to the leadership if it looked like the USSR was vulnerable to an American first strike. And by 1984, that VRAN model was spitting out some pretty terrifying numbers for the guys in the Kremlin. It calculated that Soviet power had dropped to just 45% of US power. So what did that 45% number actually mean? Well, according to their own system, 60% was considered safe. They were on par with the US, but 45%? That meant significant inferiority. And the truly chilling part was the next step down. If the balance fell below 40%, it was considered a critical danger, a point where launching their own preemptive strike might actually be justified. So you have this mounting, data-driven paranoia in Moscow. And it all came to a head in the fall of 1983, during a big NATO military exercise called Able Archer 83. And you have to remember the context here. The world was already on a razor's edge. In September, the Soviets shot down that civilian airliner, KAL-007. In October, the Beirut barracks bombing killed hundreds of U.S. Marines, and then the U.S. invaded Grenada, which was aligned with the Soviets. So it was into this absolute powder keg that NATO launched what it thought was just another routine drill. From the Western point of view, this was just business as usual. Able Archer was what they call a command post exercise, basically a simulation, a war game to practice the procedures for releasing nuclear weapons. To them, it wasn't real. But for the deeply paranoid and terrified leadership in Moscow, this did not look like a game at all. No way. Their military doctrine taught them that these kinds of exercises were the absolute perfect cover for a real surprise attack. To them, Able Archer looked like the real thing about to happen. And their reaction was, well, it was unlike anything NATO had ever seen during an exercise before. Soviet air forces in East Germany and Poland were suddenly put on high alert. They started flying an unusual number of spy planes. KGB stations all over the world were given urgent orders to look for any final sign that an attack was coming. And some reports say that nuclear missile submarines were put on shortened readiness times, ready to fire. So how was a disaster avoided? How did we get out of this? Well, we now know from this report that it came down to one U.S. Air Force intelligence officer, a guy named Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz. He saw the bizarre Soviet alert, but he made a gut decision not to raise NATO's own alert level in response. The report calls it a fortuitous, if ill-informed decision. He basically got lucky, but that lucky call broke a potential spiral of escalation that could have led right into World War III. The crisis passed, thankfully, but this massive intelligence failure on the U.S. side left behind a really profound and chilling lesson about seeing what you want to see.
And the core of the problem was a classic intelligence trap. It's called mirror imaging. It's this simple, but very dangerous, mistake of assuming your opponent sees the world just like you do. U.S. analysts knew America had no intention of starting a war, so they just assumed the Soviets had to know that too. They couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that the Soviets could be genuinely that terrified of them.
So the report argued that the big mistake was committing to just one explanation. Instead of deciding it was all propaganda, analysts should have gone to the policymakers with a range of possibilities. Okay, option 1, it's propaganda. Option 2, maybe it's a power struggle inside the Kremlin. Or option 3, it's genuine, terrifying fear that the U.S. is about to attack. And this really gets to the heart of the failure. It wasn't just about picking the most likely scenario. It was about thinking through the risk of being wrong. So what if you're wrong about the propaganda or a power struggle? The risk is pretty low, maybe medium. But the risk of being wrong about their genuine fear, of thinking they're bluffing when they're actually about to launch their missiles, well, that's catastrophic. So I think the key lesson, the main takeaway from the whole 1983 war scare is this. Misinterpreting an adversary's real fear as just aggression, well, that might be the single most dangerous mistake a superpower can ever make. And it leaves us with this really provocative question that this report forces us to ask. How do you manage a global rivalry, let alone win a Cold War, when you are totally blind to your enemy's deepest fears? It's a question that, frankly, is just as relevant today as it was back then.